Hello, welcome everybody. My name's Linda Woodhead. I'm Professor at Lancaster University, and it's my very great pleasure to be the host tonight for this conversation interview between Clifford Longley and Shirley Williams. Some of you who haven't been to our debates before, let me just fill in the background of them. They come about through a kind of serendipitous meeting of Charles Clarke and myself at Lancaster University. And I'd been running a large research program for the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council called Religion and Society. And we had a lot of good research. A few people I can see here have been on that program, doing research on that. And we wanted to get the findings out to a broader audience. So we decided to hold some public debates. We called them the Westminster Faith Debates. We had them earlier this year. And to our surprise, they were an enormous success and got a lot of attention and media coverage. The theme of them this year was religion in public life, and we decided now, in the winter, to just have a little spin-off and to take the theme a little bit deeper through some interviews. So we've had a series of 3 interviews. We had Professor John Sulston, the Nobel Prize winner, a fortnight ago, and in a fortnight's time, we're going to have Alistair Campbell interviewing Delia Smith, which should be interesting. You're very welcome to that. There are still a few places. If you want to know more about all that and about the series, we've just produced a new booklet that summarises the Westminster Faith Debates. You're very welcome to take one of these or to email me if you don't get one, and I'll send them. And they're also up on our website. If you just Google Religion and Society, you can also download them. That website also has videos and audio podcasts of all the debates and of tonight. So if you do participate in the Q&A, you should be aware that we are being filmed and recorded. If any of you want to tweet about this, please do, and the hashtag is WFI12. There's a little fire announcement, which is that if something alarming happens, there'll be a PA announcement which will tell us whether we take it seriously or not. If we do take it seriously, people will spring out from every corner and everything will be taken care of, and we go out to Dean's Yard. Right, over to the two of you. I have brought 2 of my favourite books along with me, which is part of the reason why you're both here. Clifford Longley has written a wonderful book, I think in 2002, was it? Yeah. Called Chosen People, which he describes as a grand theory of everything. And it's better than the kind of Stephen Hawking's grand theory because it explains our history in terms of a sense of destiny that the English and the Americans have, and that explains all sorts of things like empire and the foundation of Israel and so on. Thoroughly recommended. He's also known, of course, as a very distinguished journalist. Many of you will know him at the moment from his writings in the Tablet and from his regular broadcasts. He was also the religious affairs editor of the Times for, 15 years?
20 years.
20 years. Yeah. Shirley Williams, Baroness Williams of Crosby, is actually in the middle of a very important debate in the House of Lords, so we're particularly pleased to have her. She's dashed across. She will, unfortunately, have to leave at about 5 to 7, pretty promptly, to get back for the vote. So thank you for dashing out of that. And the book that I've brought of hers that I also love is called God and Caesar: Personal Reflections on Politics and Religion. It's a fantastic book. It covers huge amounts of ground also. There's a very nice bit in it where she talks about going to the newly founded Bangladesh and to a school, I don't know if you remember this, and the children were asked to draw how they imagined the foundation of their new nation. And they all drew pictures of Indira Gandhi sitting on a large cloud, creating the nation, rather like Michelangelo's God creating things. It's actually an image which I always associate with Shirley Williams herself. Sitting on a cloud, rising above so many things, and a life of incredible achievement. So, over to the 2 of you, and we're going to have the first half of interview, and then we'll throw it open to all of you to please ask your questions to Shirley, and also Clifford's happy to answer some questions.
Shirley, good evening, and thank good evening to everybody. Fantastic turnout considering how miserable the weather is at the moment. Shirley, can we just establish a protocol that I can call you Shirley?
You can.
And you can call me...
No, you don't have to call me God.
No. You don't want to be called my lady or anything like that.
Nothing like that.
You can call me Clifford or Cliff or you dirty rat or anything else that comes to you. Yes?
Yes.
Right. And it's an unusual occasion because politicians on the whole don't do God. Politicians are a bit shy about wearing their personal beliefs, etc., on their sleeves. I think later on we might discuss why that is. But nevertheless, it is the case that you have agreed to expose this side of yourself, but which you are normally quite discreet, if I may say, as a lifelong watcher of Shirley Williams, to be a little bit less discreet than you normally would want to be. Can I just add one more thing, by the way? You don't know this, but I did use up quite a lot of shoe leather canvassing you when you stood as a test candidate for test in Southampton.
Yes, I'm very pleased about that.
Beaten hollow, I seem to remember.
Yeah. Well, no, it was hollow to start with.
It was hollow to start with, but it was worse than we expected. I got very drunk that night, I'm afraid. But anyway, that's how I first came across knowing about your existence. Now, I gave you a hint of what my first question might be, because it seemed to me better that you should have some idea in advance. And that was to ask you a question about your personal faith through this vehicle. What can you tell us is your favourite story from the New Testament, from the Gospels? And can you tell us, in your own words, what the story is and why?
Well, first, Clifford, thank you very much for doing this. Very nice of you. I got great respect for you, so that's much nicer than being interviewed by Alistair Campbell, which may happen next week to somebody else. And
may happen to you.
Secondly, I do want to apologise to the audience. I'm really sorry, but I'm afraid it's a very good example of how morality and politics get mixed up together, because the bill that we have in the present time in the House of Lords is the so-called closed material proceedings. It's the issue about whether there should be closed courts for the first time really ever in civil proceedings in Britain, in England. The habit of open courts goes back nearly 1,000 years. So it's not a trivial one. I would skip a trivial vote for you. I can't skip this one because the votes are now turning on about majorities of 2 or 3, and they are about really absolutely crucial issues like whether people should be treated as innocent until they're found to be guilty and things of that kind. So I hope you'll forgive me. I'm really sorry, but I will come back for Charles and for you and for Cliff anytime they summon me, unless I'm summoned that way instead. Answering, that is not a way of avoiding Clifford's question. I'm going to quote not 1, but 3 bits of the Gospel. Matthew 5, John 12, and Luke 15. What are they all about? Well, they're all about something which is absolutely central to today's debate, because they're all about occasions when Jesus was speaking to a woman and the apostles intervened to tell him not to waste his time in one way or another. Some will remember, for example, the woman at the well who Jesus asked to give him a glass of water. And it actually says in the scriptures that the apostles were angry and asked Christ why he was talking to a woman. There's the occasion when Mary dries the feet of Christ with her own hair, and again the apostles, or rather in this case the disciples, protest that this is an absurd way to go on, and that the money should have been sold, the oil that she pours over his head should have been sold and the money used to help the poor. Incidentally, the disciple who suggested that was Judas Iscariot. And Christ responds by saying that she has a better understanding of what really matters, which is that he will only come once to the earth and will then not come again until the second coming. And therefore, it's appropriate and right that Mary should go out of her way to indicate that he is somebody very special and very unlike other human beings. And there are other cases of that kind. You remember when he said to Mary, the Mary and Martha sisters, when he said to her, "You have the better part." What was the better part? It was that Mary was giving to thinking, to meditating, to speaking very carefully, whereas Martha, like me, bustled around the place trying to do the business. Jesus Christ is quite right, but his remark, to me at least, suggests that he thinks of Mary as being, in the fullest sense, human and capable of looking into some of the deepest issues that confront humanity. Why is it, then, I ask myself, and I promise not to go on much longer about this, but to me it's very central, why is it that Jesus Christ in the New Testament treats women so differently from the way in which the disciples treat women. They dismiss them all the way through. He, time and again, stops to talk with them, to listen to them, just as important as talking to them, listen to them. And at the end, in every case, at least that I can read in the Bible over the recent years, comes down, so to speak, on the side of listening to the women and of comforting and encouraging them. So on a day like today, I simply wish to cluster together that group of gospel readings to say that the gospel does not support the idea that women are in some sense a second sex. On the contrary, again and again, it says that women and men alike are children of God. And I have to say on today, when I deeply, deeply grieve at the decision of the House of Laity in the Anglican Church, and I'll certainly grieve equally about the failure of the Catholic Church to almost give any role to women at all, except that of being obedient worshippers, you will understand why I want to start this interview by this rather fiercely controversial set of remarks.
Well, that does invite an interesting question. I understand that there is some issue already raised today that certain politicians want the state to intervene. And they want to have either the Church of England's exemption from the equalities legislation or something much larger, maybe disestablishment altogether, as a result of their disappointment at the vote in the General Synod yesterday evening. So it may well be that people like you and me are going to have to start thinking about the politics of this issue. Now, how would you stand on that? Are you willing to intervene? Or do you think it's an Anglican affair and we Catholics should keep away from it?
Sort of between the two, really. I think typical of a third party, I suppose. I've talked quite a lot to the bishops in the House of Lords, who are very, very agreeable lot of gentlemen, and most of whom, incidentally, are strongly in favour of women being both priests and bishops, and who are clearly today very upset and very disturbed. The important thing, I think, is the fact that the two houses that represent the clergy, both supported by the necessary two-thirds majority, women becoming bishops. The house that didn't was, of course, all too obviously the house of the laity. And I think it is for the church, in effect, to say that the truth of the matter is the house of the laity is not representative of young Anglicans, it's not representative very much of young people. It's, I think, in many ways, the house of retired Anglicans, because you have to have a lot of spare time to be the house of the laity. So I think the church should begin by addressing its own constitutional structures.
Okay, would you, if it came to the point, would you favour disestablishment?
Not particularly, no. I think there's quite a lot to be said for an established church.
Okay, could you explain what the case for establishment is?
Well, the case for establishment, I think, are three. One, there's a very specific case for establishment if you still live in a monarchy. Because at the end of the day, what is the Queen? What does she is based on? The defender of the faith. Yeah. The faith is not just Anglicanism. In a broader sense, it's increasingly Christianity. And I think because the Queen, or any monarch of the United Kingdom, in this case, the Queen is also head of the Commonwealth, which contains thousands of Muslims and thousands of Hindus and thousands of Catholics and thousands of Jews, it's appropriate that the Queen should be the head of the established church, given that also Lambeth is the centre to which Anglicans throughout the world come. It's, if you like, a mini Vatican, without quite the particular powers and authority of the Pope. So, no, I think there's a lot to be said for an established church. I also think, personally, that there's a lot to be said for children who attend schools which are church schools, and there are, I think, 40% of primary schools in Britain are church schools, and something like 25% of secondary schools. I think that, oddly enough, played into a very high level of tolerance in this country between religions.
You're obviously a progressive person. I mean, your whole history has been of causes, of campaigns, of political activity designed to stand up for the underdog, the poor, anybody, any group that's persecuted or deprived. And this is your political image. We're very, very familiar with it, and you're much loved for it, if I may say so. But is this also an expression of your faith?
Yes, almost completely.
Could you tell me how that works?
Well, I should make it very clear that my faith is very centred on the lessons of Jesus Christ. I am not a great admirer of the institutional church or the institutional churches. I'll be very honest and say that I think they have a great deal to answer for over the last 40 or 50 years. I'll come back later, we no doubt will come back later, Clifford, to things like Vatican II, which I think was a colossal renaissance of spiritual feeling in this country. But having said that, I have to say there have also been grave, grave weaknesses in the institutional churches, including my own. So why am I this, as you say, this character caught up in causes and so on? I think almost entirely because, at least as I read the New Testament, and bits of the Old Testament, and the last parts of Job and so on, are simply staggering descriptions of the power of God in an often evil universe. But I think I would say quite directly that for me, the teachings of Christ are very clear. They're teachings about the marginalised, the poor, the rejected, the outsider. They tell you a great deal about how you should treat asylum seekers, how you should treat people who are poor, people who are wretched, people who are not particularly well educated. And I guess I'd have to say that, to use a rather corny phrase, that what to me comes across very loud and clear is that Jesus Christ is no member of the establishment. Indeed, the establishment hated him. The establishment of his time was obviously the Pharisees, and to some extent the Sadducees, a deeply factional bunch of people caught up in the establishment of the Palestine of that time, and to some extent of the Roman Empire, but primarily in this case, or context, the Palestine of that time. And I have to say that they were themselves living accusations of the power of institutional faith.
Let me ask you a question that arises from that. You and I are both Roman Catholics. Why are we? I mean, we're very well aware of the catalogue of sins that could be laid at the door of probably any church, but the Catholic Church in particular. There's a passage in your Climbing the Bookshelves where you're talking, I think, to Robert Runcie. And I think you use a phrase in your description of that conversation, I'll quote it, trying to resolve why, as a young adult, you chose to be baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. Can you resolve that for us now?
Yes, I think I probably can. First of all, I have to say, I mean, this is a very personal discussion we're having. I was, of course, considerably influenced by my father.
Sure, yes.
My
who was a
father,
convert to Catholicism himself.
Who was a convert, and whose own father had been an Anglican vicar, which is quite an important fact. It took an awful lot of courage for the only son of an Anglican vicar in Liverpool, of all places, to become a Catholic. And
yes,
it was, my father used to say that he'd have to look out in the morning as a schoolboy and decide which street he was going to walk down, because down one street he would be clapped and down the other street he would be stoned. A little bit like Jerusalem today, I have to say. So, we've forgotten how passionately sectarian some of our cities were. They still are a bit, but nothing like in my father's day. And I greatly respected and admired him, so I think he had a big influence on me. He was very much an intellectual. He was not a cradle Catholic in the sense that his faith came up with his breakfast. He thought his way through becoming a Catholic by way of Cardinal Newman almost entirely. He was at Oxford at the time that the Newman Society was established and so forth. So I think two things really. One was that I was attracted to the Roman Catholic Church because it was global, or at the very least international. Yep. I didn't like the idea very much of a church being, well, I talked about the establishment. I wasn't keen at the time at all about the idea of a national church, or let alone a nationalist church. Secondly, I was attracted to the fact that the Roman Catholic Church, as well as spreading out across the whole of the world, could speak in many, many languages. And I don't just mean literal languages, I also mean the languages of different kinds of spirituality. And I think the other thing that probably attracted me very much was that it was so difficult to be a Catholic. I liked the idea, I've always liked climbing mountains rather than walking up parks. And the Roman Catholic Church constituted huge demands on the people that belonged to it. Much greater, I think it's fair to say, than most other denominations. And I suppose I felt at the age of 17 or 18 when I'd been brought up by my father, I should explain. I'm a half cradle and half convert Catholic. My parents were socialist, and therefore they thought it was inappropriate they didn't conduct infant baptism. I think if they had, it would have led to a huge row between my mother and father. But my father took me to church every Sunday, and obviously hoped I would become a Catholic, but didn't feel he could insist that when I was 1 1/4 months old, I should be forced to become a Catholic. And so that too, I think, was a major factor for me, that the that it was difficult, that I came to it when I was 18 and already had thoughts of my own. But essentially those two factors were...
Well, one question that occurs to me, arising from that, is why be anything? I mean, we're surrounded by, in the society, lots and lots of people who don't feel it necessary to have a denominational allegiance, as you and I do.
Well, I think I have to go back again to lessons of Christ. I mean, the lessons of the New Testament and of what Christ said was so fundamentally went deep into everything I stood and believed for. And I suppose I'd have to say, though many people in this audience will get very cross with me for saying it, I saw democratic socialism almost a kind of extension of the Christian ethic into the political field. And quite a lot of other people did it, well, they still do to some extent, but particularly at that time. People forget, for example, the Labour Party was born out of Methodism as much as out of Marx, if not more. I think the famous remark was made by Morgan Phillips, who was the General Secretary of the Labour Party. You'll remember this, Cliff, back at the fairly early in the 20th century, where he actually said the Labour Party owes more to Methodism than it does to Marx. It certainly owed a great deal to Methodism and a certain amount to Catholicism, particularly in Scotland and in the Celtic countries. Yes. So I think all of that added together into...
Well, certainly inner city Labour parties always had their Catholic mafia, didn't they?
They always had the Catholic mafia, and sometimes it was a very tough mafia. But sometimes they also had, even outer city ones, often had an intellectual element that was Catholic too. So I think it was holistic in a way. It all came together.
Specifically, did you turn your back on the Church of England, or do you ever feel drawn to the Church of England?
No, never really did, I don't think. My mother, at this stage, my mother had a great influence on my life as well as my father, but at this stage in my life, I'm about 17, it's caught up in the immediate aftermath of the great welfare state and the new National Health Service and all the rest of it. And I suppose what was the case at that time was that the Anglican Church was, oddly enough, less involved in all that than the Catholic Church. Cardinal Griffin, as you probably know, I don't know whether people in the audience will know because they're mostly younger than I am, but Cardinal Griffin was actually appointed by the Vatican, who believed that Britain was going communist. And they saw Cardinal Griffin, who was himself the son of a docker and came from a very blue-collar background, as being the kind of possible antidote to what they saw as a slip towards communism. There never was a serious slip towards communism in England, there never has been. But the Vatican, from its distance, I'm afraid that's one of the troubles with the Vatican, it does get things quite badly wrong sometimes, did have this sort of horror that this was what was happening, that socialism was sweeping Europe. And what it didn't recognise at that time, and not indeed till a lot later, was that in fact socialism, or communism if you like, and social democracy were actually at odds all over the continent, fighting one another, rather than one being part of one and the other the other.
It's interesting you say that. I was in Australia and I was hearing a lot about the problems the Australian Labour Party had on this issue between communists and Catholics. It was duplicated in many parts of this country, where there was a big struggle for the soul of the Labour Party between these two influences.
Can I add one rider to that very quickly? Well, my husband and I taught in the University of the Western Cape for a while, just at the time that Nelson Mandela came out of prison. We were asked to go and set up an institute to try to train young people to become civil servants, because the new government was happy to have some white civil servants and it didn't want only white civil servants. So we set up this institute, both frankly because we'd both been teaching at the Kennedy School in America. And what was fascinating to me was on the campus of the Western Cape, which was a traditionally coloured university, as you know, not a white one, not a black one, but a coloured one, mixed race one, was that there was there was an end of the civil war going on between South African communists, led by Joe Slovo and his daughter, and on the other side, South African Catholics, with a lot of influence from Cardinal Hurley, and Archbishop Hurley rather, and other Catholics and other Christians, including, of course, several very distinguished Anglicans like Archbishop Tutu. So what I actually saw in front of my eyes at the point of this huge transition was a battle between Christians and communists for the soul of the African National Congress.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Catholic social teaching, if we may. If you remember, the encyclical Rerum Novarum of 1891 addressed precisely a Western world that looked as if it was about to be consumed by a conflict between capital and labour. You tell her that this is your show, not mine, but it seemed to me it was an attempt to produce, if you like, another narrative about the way in which we might run our modern economy. What's the role of the Catholic Church now, in your view? all the way through looking at the European Union, the current situation, the collapse of the old assumptions of capitalism, etc.
Coming back for a moment, just to show off as well.
Go on.
I remember the encyclical called De Rerum Novarum
Yeah.
by, I think, Leo XIII, which was the beginning of kind of the end of medieval Catholicism, I suppose. Well, perhaps that put it too strongly, but it was a recognition that the Industrial Revolution, as you rightly said, had brought a whole set of new dilemmas.
Strongly influenced, I think, by Cardinal Manning, was it not?
Yes, I think
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
yes. And it's a marvellous encyclical even now. It's astonishingly insightful in many
Well, the
ways.
present Archbishop of Canterbury is like, the Archbishop of Canterbury elect is very
Well,
keen on it and mentions it almost every time he opens his mouth.
That's perfectly true.
Yeah.
Even the present one, I think, was fairly sympathetic to that. Very straightforwardly, gosh, you raise a huge question, I'd have to give you a huge answer, but I'll make it as short as I can.
We're all here.
We're all here.
Weighing on your every word.
Nobody's gone yet.
No.
Anyway, the answer is, I think, crucially, that the Christian churches have to take on the issue of the loss of a moral compass. Now, we have, I think, as a society, in this society, in Europe, the United States to some extent, all of us lost our moral compass. Tragically, the church defines that time and again almost entirely in terms of sexual morality. I voted against the abortion law. I think that abortion is a very serious thing to do. I wouldn't go as far as what happened in Ireland a couple of weeks ago, but I do think there's a case for saying that if the mother's life is at risk, she should be allowed to have an abortion. But I've never seen abortions other than a huge decision for somebody to make, not just a choice, but a huge decision. Having said that, I'm very critical of the church in terms of its opposition to birth control. I think it's completely ludicrous.
Mm-hmm.
I spent, especially you can argue about the circumstances in which birth control can be used, and you can argue if you like it should be something that married people are allowed to have, but even that's a bit silly, because one of the things that came through to me loud and clear when I was visiting a very dear friend of mine, a Catholic missionary priest in Brazil, where he was actually overseeing a seminary, in Belo Horizonte, which is the Sheffield of Brazil, was the number of people that came up to him and said that they had no choice about having an abortion because this was their sixth child and the family couldn't afford it. Now, in a situation like that...
And there was no contraception, presumably.
No contraception was allowed at that time in Brazil. I'm not even sure it is now, but it certainly wasn't then. So what you would actually, to put it very crudely, what many, many women were being driven to was having to opt for an abortion because the church wouldn't allow them to have birth control. And in societies where there's particularly a very strong male ethic, which is, I'll sleep with you I want, to actually refuse to allow their wives to use contraception is time and again to actually commit them to abortion. Terrible abortions with, steel dress hangers and things of that kind.
But that refusal is often more to do with misogyny than it is with faith, is it not?
Oh, no, it is. But the point I was making was that in a misogynistic society, it's hopeless to think that the woman can actually impose abstention because she can't.
No, I see your point.
And that's my point, really. I mean, she's the weaker party. And therefore the church, I think, is driven to have to choose. And I think it's made the wrong choice. I think we have to accept, admittedly in many ways, a very sexually aware society, that contraception cannot be rejected unless you are willing to accept a larger number of abortions. And frankly, if you're boringly like me, given to looking at statistics, it leaps out at you. The level of illegal abortions is much, much higher in societies that don't accept contraception than those that do. Now, that doesn't mean you have to say, every child of 12 shall have sexual relations. That's deep in the way in which you approach the ethics of a society. And I think there are many, many ways. I'll give you one example. When I was Education Secretary, it's sort of something about this country that you could have a practicing Roman Catholic as the Education Secretary. It's quite remarkable in many ways. Very hard to do in France, I can tell you. But what came out of that, I think very clearly and very well, was, and I argued that we should combine, and I still believe this, in fact I've said so to Mr. Gove, parenting with sex education, not split them one from the other, as if sex education was all about nothing but biology, let alone human beings. And parenting was something that was irrelevant or could be seen quite separately from sex education. It can't. They should be seen as a spectrum. you start by teaching children about biology, but you go on to bring home to them the huge consequences of sexual activity and the essential requirement of the child to be brought up for up to 20 years. I think I might say 26 now, since I have quite a lot of grandchildren. But it's got to be, it's a very long spectrum. And to divorce the two, as we've done in all our schools, except some of the faith schools, between parenting and sex education, I think it's a very grave mistake. They belong together. They should be taught together. The kids should be allowed to discuss them together. And I think that will begin to change attitudes to abortion, among other things, but certainly change attitudes towards the risk of bearing children when you can't afford them.
Given that this agenda of points where you disagree with the Catholic Church's official position has been there a long time, and I suppose it's probably quite a long list. I've read your Notre Dame lectures where you enumerate some of them.
I've read your columns.
Oh, thank you.
Same
okay,
point.
well, very similar. Isn't most people would think, wouldn't they not? Well, those are jolly good reasons for ceasing to be a Roman Catholic rather than to stay in. And now, does this tell me that your faith is in fact very, very deep? Is that the right answer? That you are not prepared to give it up?
No, I'm not prepared to give it up. I don't quite know why. What I do think I would say is that, I'm very, the saint who cries out to me most loudly is St. Thomas. Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief.
Doubting Thomas, yeah.
Yes, doubting Thomas. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the modern world is a doubting world, by and large. Even for people of faith, it's a doubting world, because we're so imbued with, the principles of science and evidential statements and so forth, that it's very difficult to be just an unthinking believer in acceptance of faith. Yeah. I can't do that. But I also think that doubting Thomas says it exactly right for me. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. So yes, I do believe very, very strongly in, as I've already said, the teachings of Jesus Christ. I work my way around the Trinity a bit, but when I read particularly some of the Old Testament Gospels, like, for example, or not Gospels, rather, lessons, like, for example, particularly Job, but also Isaiah.
Mm-hmm, yes.
What comes through to you is the extraordinary power of God and the unknowability of him. And that's when you get back to
you talked about doubt. When you go to Mass, do you struggle with doubt? Or do you find it a spiritual refreshment without a big debate in your head?
I think I probably when I go to Mass, to some extent, I don't stop thinking, but I tend to turn to thinking about, for example, friends or members of my family who are going through a terribly hard time, or that kind of thing, rather than to think. I don't sort of sit there having intellectual conversations myself, but I do have intellectual conversations myself, but normally not at Mass.
Okay, so you don't have a big problem over, for example, the doctrine of the real presence of
not really.
Christ in the Mass, yeah?
No.
And you go to communion, do you?
Of course.
Yes, yeah. That means a lot to you.
Yes,
Could you explain to us, because I could answer your question, but I could answer my own question, but tell us what it means to you.
Well, I think fundamentally what it is a structure of my life and my relationship with others, which is what's the right word for it? I mean, it's indispensable. Now,
Would you call it fuel? Is that a good word? Fuel for the soul?
Yes, I think that's a
Refreshment?
perfectly good word, yeah. And when I sound so critical of the Church, it's because, here we go, one more of your questions, which is Vatican II gave me a sense of what the Church could be. I think Vatican II was probably the most marvellous spiritual experience for me, beyond a much earlier one, which was oddly enough very personal, because it was to do with my mother's rejection of the mass bombing of Germany.
Yes.
And that brought with it a huge spiritual upheaval in my family. And I still think she was right, but it was not an easy time. She was certainly condemned by almost everybody. And for her, I think she then came back to in her case, the Church of England, from quite a long period of agnosticism, driven partly by the scale of death of the First World War. And when she decided she had to speak out against the mass bombing of Germany, she knew at that moment that all her, as it were, worldly position was being put at risk. In fact, one of her main publishers wrote and said, "I'll never publish anything by you again." She was denounced by Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt and so forth. So for her, it was to actually risk everything. And the thing that I think brought her through, she wrote a book which almost nobody reads called Humiliation with Honour. It's not like Testament of Youth or Testament of Friendship. it's a book consisting of letters to my brother, and they try to explain to my brother, who was then in the Air Force, why she had taken the stance that she had, and why she felt it was essential to do so. So that was, in a sense, the first big spiritual sort of confrontation. It wasn't mine, it was hers, but I understood and felt enough for her to see what it cost her. Then much later you get, and in some ways the church understood that, the Roman Catholic Church didn't denounce her, and Dorothy Day in the United States strongly supported her. So she got some element of support from the Roman Church, not from anybody else. You then leap all the way to Vatican II, which is so suffused with what seem to be the two great principles of Christianity, namely peace and compassion, that you suddenly, obviously Gaudium et Spes to me is like a lighthouse. Suddenly
That's the church in the modern world, the last document of Vatican II.
Joy and hope. And when you see which incidentally I gather the Pope at that time, John the 23rd, well it wasn't John the 23rd anymore, it's Paul VI, had quite a lot of difficulty getting through the bureaucracy of the Vatican, but it's a marvellous document, and I think the whole way in which the Vatican II threw light on the rejuvenation of the church, certainly in someone like me, it just relit all the embers.
Where did it go wrong?
It went wrong essentially because the Vatican got scared. It had suddenly acquired this vast march of human beings who suddenly saw, I think in a way they haven't seen anywhere else in Christianity, though I will exempt for a moment some aspects of the Church of England, because I think it's been brave. But it suddenly...
The Catholic Church in England, you mean?
No, the Church of England.
Oh, the Church of England,
I'll say something about the Church of England in just a minute. But it lit up the scene. And I think, all over the world, because I've travelled a lot in my life, all over the world, you suddenly saw the light shine out of people's eyes. Catholics in India, Catholics in the Philippines, wherever I went, there was this sense of coming alive again and of a spring, a Catholic spring, if you like.
Rebirth,
And the other thing to say about it very quickly is that it was also very carefully thought out. It wasn't just a sort of bunch of, dare I say, sentimental tweets. It was a very deeply thought through set of theological insights. And it gave the Church a foundation to leap forward into a difficult modern world, in my view. The Church, Paul VI got terrified over Humanae Vitae, the
birth control encyclical.
The birth control encyclical, which the committee that had drawn it up, I think by a substantial majority, favoured. But Paul VI, who was a good man, I think, was persuaded by some of the bishops around him that to sign Humanae Vitae, which I think would have changed the relationship of the Church to many, many of its own members, would be to effectively undermine the positions taken by all his predecessors.
Did it not, in fact, do more damage to the authority of the Church?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think absolutely it did.
So it had the opposite effect to the one he was...
But that's what I think. In fact, you know far better than I do, Clifford. Isn't that probably the right judgment about what influenced him?
Certainly so. Certainly so. He was afraid.
He was afraid.
That the Catholic Church took such a different line that everyone would say, well, what else might it change?
Which is
albeit that in the Second Vatican Council, things like the Declaration on Religious Liberty, for example, or Nostra Aetate on the status of the relationship between Christians and Jews, were themselves quite revolutionary.
And they were absolutely wonderful. And just taking the one between the relationship between Christians and Jews, the recognition of what had happened to Jews, and the extent to which, to put it bluntly, our church had not. Well, I know what Paul XII thought, which was that it would be handing the church over to communism if it went that way. But we have to say there was rather a failure at that time. And all of a sudden, this document put that failure right.
There's a nice phrase from a theologian called John Baptiste Metz, that it is forbidden to do theology with your back turned to Auschwitz. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't. It's a wonderful phrase.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful phrase.
Yeah.
We went to Auschwitz, and if you talk about manufacturing, turning human beings entirely instruments. Even worse, I think, is Bergen-Belsen. I don't know if
in a little while, we're going to start asking the audience if they'd like to ask you. But I've got one more question for you, if I may.
Let me just finish on
yes,
one
do,
thing.
please.
Sorry, the only thing I want to say about Bergen-Belsen is when you go there, Auschwitz is a bunch of sort of army huts, basically, but you go to Bergen-Belsen and what you see, which is breathtakingly awful, is the size of the railway, which simply carried thousands upon thousands of Europe's Jews straight from the station at Bergen down a railway line, no stopping, no station, no nothing, straight into the ovens at the end of the railway line. And it's when you realise that it was the industrialisation of evil that it really comes home to you. And the fact that human beings allowed it to happen still amazes me. It does show how very deeply evil, in many ways, our species is.
Is it inbred?
Is it?
Is it inbred? Are we instinctively evil?
I'm a great believer in our being both good and evil.
And do you believe, therefore, in the fall, in original sin? Does that throw any light on it for you?
As a metaphor.
As a metaphor.
I don't believe in the literary story of Adam and Eve. I don't know how can I really? But what I do believe in is that as a metaphor, it's a wonderful metaphor.
You've been very open with us about your religious beliefs. Are you aware you spent a lot of your time being rather discreet about your beliefs? You didn't do God for a lot of time. Is that true?
Well,
Is that fair?
I'm not quite like Tony Blair, whose religious conversion I think is absolutely honourable and
Genuine, yeah.
Genuine, yeah. But I didn't want to have. Above all, I didn't want the press to be holding me up as a kind of pious character. I should make it very clear, I'm not a great lover of piety. I think too many Christians walk about looking really gloomy and very pious, and as if the life of the world aren't.
Well, in the true sense of the word, I think you're very pious, as a matter of fact, but that's not the way the world understands the term, is it?
I kept saying piety.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very bad at endlessly counting the rosary, for example.
Yeah.
And
Oh, that kind of piety, yeah.
But that's a very deep piety for some people. Not my kind.
But you have a profound religious instinct, it seems to me, which is the proper meaning of the word piety.
It's sweet of you to say so. I'm not going to claim it.
Okay, well, that's correct. Now, okay, I think we have heard some very interesting and, if I may say so, to give you credit, revealing insights into your personal faith. Have you ever done this before? Have you ever had this opportunity?
Yeah, once or twice.
Yeah.
Yes, I long ago. You probably remember that the Bishop of Liverpool at the time, Bishop Kelly, had a really wonderful conference about Catholicism and the family, and it was one of the most sort of thoughtful conferences of that kind I've been at. It wasn't a recital of sort of unthought-through ideas, and I remember at that occasion, not specifically directed at me, but it was revelatory in all sorts of ways about people.
Okay. Linda.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you so much, and thank you both. And let's throw it open now and take some questions. I'll take them in batches of 3 and then pass them over. Yes, please.
From the little I know about life is full of setbacks, and you do things. For instance, you're talking about the vote today about inventing closed courts when we've had open courts. I'd just like to hear a little bit from you how your faith has managed that you can keep going, because some of us think, well, actually, if I can't get what I think is right, I'll watch telly, because that would be simple.
Well, let's. Can you?
Sorry.
There's one at the back.
Sorry.
Hold on to them.
No, of course.
Blessed good evening to you all.
Oh, could you introduce yourselves?
My name is Eliza Ives. Blessed good evening to you all. Thank you for coming, Shirley. The question I was about to ask is, in the creed it says, I believe in the Holy Ghost, the Holy Catholic and the Apostolic Church, and this is where the Church of England are saying this creed. Now, to me, I had a dream to say that the Catholic Church is the right church here in England. I also noticed that at the monument station, right at the top of the building, there are words saying, all worship be to God only. I don't know how many people have seen that, and I was surprised when I saw it. I also want to say is, I believe that this land is paved with God, not gold. I booted the hell out. The other thing is, Shirley, you were talking about scriptures just now, and you mentioned the 3 women. And it's funny enough, I heard the answer to the debate about the women being archbishop or whatever. And I said to myself, but look, in the scriptures, the same thing you said about Mary and the way Jesus treated women. And today, I'm coming here to hear you say the same thing. In the metro, I was saying to myself, I'm looking through the metro and I'm saying, No, just one
Quickly.
last
Very
thing.
quick.
Just one last thing.
Quick last thing.
I was looking through the metro and I'm saying to myself, why isn't it there a debate about Christianity or somewhere, just like Lloyd Webber having all these shows around? And I said, I wish I could go and ask Lloyd Webber to have a Westminster faith debate. And today, it's happened. So I just want to pass all this thing happened to me today and during the week.
Thank you very
All
much.
right.
And there's one over in this corner. Thank you.
Hello, this is this on?
Yes, it
Maybe
is.
not. Okay, John Pritchard, Bishop of Oxford, so feeling highly embarrassed today.
Quite right.
Really hugely disappointed, and I just apologise to everybody, really. But the church does disappoint us and does mess up in so many ways, and Baroness Williams, you were saying that we're always disappointed by the church. I just wonder, is there an alternative? Can we avoid institutional religion? You know, we normally say we need something to carry the faith on from one generation to another and to give it its shape and so on. But do you think we are so disappointing that we could somehow do without institutionalised religion?
And can I just chip in on that? And
Sure.
for younger people and your grandchildren as well, you know, how would you advise them in relation to that kind of issue? But over to you for to reply to any of those.
Okay, right. Well, first, let me just say to the lady who asked about Monument, I'll go up and have a look. I didn't know it was there either, so thank you very much for giving me another spot to look at in London, a very special kind of what you said generally, and I'm glad you agree with me about the Church's attitude towards women. On the question that I was asked about, you know, how does one deal with setbacks? And life is full of setbacks, also full of joys. It's very important to recognise that all the time. And the answer is I wouldn't go and look at the telly if I have a setback. I'm sorry to sound rather kind of girl guide-ish, but what I do is I go for a walk, if possible, a long way from London. And I find that I think I sometimes think to myself to be almost a kind of child of the natural God, because one of the things that has always given me a huge amount of strength and pleasure is walking in hills. I lift up my eyes to the hills from whence cometh my help. I think that the sheer kind of continuation of nature and the creatures that emerge out of it are a colossal source of strength and happiness and joy. And so, I mean, if anybody asked me, I would say I continually and almost endlessly enjoy my life. Now, it's perfectly true that I'm a very aggressive character. So actually, I don't terribly mind setbacks in politics, because what it does to me is say, well, there's another round and maybe I'll win the next one. So I'm not very feminine in the traditional sense in that way. And so I really enjoy it. And I think if we lose tonight, when I go back to vote, I shall jolly well round my friends up and we'll try and fight the next round. So I don't have a sense of it being a terminal thing. I have a sense of it being a continuing thing where one keeps the struggle going. In answer to the Bishop Pritchard, very interesting question. Let me say two things, really. First of all, no, I don't think the institutional church can be easily dispensed with. I know I've been very critical about it. But let me say the way in which I think it shouldn't be. I don't think the right thing for the churches to do, really, is to retreat from what I was saying about the loss of a moral compass. I think the right thing for it to do is to stand out and now, once again, begin to proclaim, as, for example, Wesley did in the 19th century, its moral compass. And that's why I welcome many of the things that the current Archbishop of Canterbury has bravely said about things like inequality, about poverty, about racism and so forth. I think he's been brave. But I think he probably puts his arguments across in rather more theological language appropriate to a great scholar, which he is, than the next Archbishop is likely to do. The next Archbishop, having been brought up partly in the world of business in the city, and I suspect having had something very close to a kind of moment at Jericho, is going to be able to talk to people who have lost their moral compass in a way that is much more close to their understanding than Archbishop Rowan could have done, good as he is. And I think that may be a wake-up call for the Church of England, and by way of the Church of England for the rest of us, because I'm sorry to make this a rather long answer, but it's a rather important question. My own feeling is that the Church should now stand up and say, for example, that quite a lot of the things that have happened in banking, in taxation, in tax avoidance, or for that matter in exploiting other people by taking benefits they're not entitled to, are morally wrong. And it should say that loudly, and it should go as far as it possibly can away from the days when it used to bless the arms before battle.
You could take two questions and put them together in a way. The question about how do you handle setback, and the question about the setback that occurred in the General Synod yesterday evening.
Are you asking the Bishop?
No, I'm commenting. It seems to me that your answer of keeping going is probably relevant to both situations. And in the Church of England, it occurs to me that they got very close, did they not, Bishop? 6 votes in the House of Laity, am I right?
6 votes was all it did.
All it did it, yes. Well, my own view is that I'm not an Anglo-Catholic or evangelical, obviously, not of those parties at all. But it seems to me that one should sit down with the people who voted no and ask them, can they move? And if so, on what terms could they move? You got so near, did you not? Well, why not just have another go? Walking the second mile, I think, is an expression you ought to recognise.
And also take great comfort in the fact that both the houses connected with the clergy voted in favour of women priests and women bishops. That's extraordinary to me.
Okay, we've got several
Not
more
my lot.
people wanting to jump in. So at the back first, and then Jeremy there. Can you stick your arm up again? Have you got the microphone? Yeah. And then there's one at the front, please. Please.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. John Wood, Association of Commonwealth Universities. Your mention of the University of Western Cape, I spent the last few days with the Vice-Chancellor, Brian O'Connell, and we were discussing this whole basis of moral basis for university education and how we can overcome the greed culture that now pervades universities worldwide, and yet at the same time avoid the radicalism of Islamic and other universities like that. Have you any comment on that?
And here, please.
Jeremy Crant, Department of Religious Studies, University of Kent. You've spoken of your perceptions of religion. I wonder whether we might turn it the other way round and to reflect a little bit about your own community of politicians and to really raise the question of where has the conviction politics, which you have so candidly and honestly spoken about through the last decades, where has that disappeared? Has the professionalisation, the desire for social capital and prestige meant that we've lost a desire for conviction, perhaps if there is a fear of conviction? And what happens to our moral compass when mediatisation and professionalisation take over our politics rather than the convictions which you've so wonderfully demonstrated over the last decades?
Thank you. Yes, please.
I think I want to continue that. My name's Peter Stevenson. I'm a local minister in the United Reformed Church down at the Elephant and Castle. As society does demand that its voice gets heard and the individual more and more believes that it can have its choice, then when we get a debate about, say, assisted suicide, and we want to take a moral compass view on that, how as a politician and also as a person of faith, that the two things get brought together or not?
Thank you. Shirley.
Goodness. Well, I'll do my best, and maybe I can persuade Clifford to come in too, just to enable us to have two minds on this, not just one. Let me begin by the one that was asked about the. Well, I come to yours about professionalisation of politics in a moment. I'm trying to get the order right. What was the order of the questions? Can you remember?
Universities, conviction.
That's right. Okay, universities first. One of the great problems for universities, and I regret it very much, is that they are now, of course, increasingly dependent upon business and other donors, mostly coming out of the business and finance world. And that means that they are torn, really, between their need to have enough money not only to keep going, but to attract people who are really exceptional scholars and dons, and on the other hand, the almost inevitable pressure that involves to move away towards more employment-related education. And what we're seeing now is a major shift or major pressure on universities to be able to argue that the graduates they produce are going to be able to step into a business role or a retail role or whatever, a market role, almost right away. It is the marketisation of universities. You will have gathered by this time that I'm not a passionate supporter of marketisation, certainly not of universities. And I will say, going back to the time when I was Education Secretary, and at that whole time, I don't mean just me, I mean lots of people at that time, we didn't question that substantial money should go to universities for the humanities, because we saw university education as being a holistic thing, covering the whole of culture, not just science or university, but one or the other. Now, I think what's happened are, first of all, the pressures of examinations at the school level and the ludicrous amount of weight that is put upon results at GCSE or results at A-level, carried also by all the newspapers which carry the results all the time now, means that the ability of the genius or the person who's got an extraordinary insight or the poet or the physicist who's capable of looking beyond what he is supposed to learn is beginning to be, I think, downgraded in a very frightening way. I don't think our universities, if we go on down this track, are going to be the universities that they were 15 or 20 years ago, although one very good thing is that they've thrown open their doors much more widely to people from poorer homes and to people from minority communities and so on. That's good. But the trouble is the content is beginning to go, I think, badly awry. So my view about that is that, first of all, the universities have got to try to recruit supporters and champions from outside their own ranks. They tend to be, frankly, a bit incestuously involved with one another and not really try to attract the support that they need from wider members of the public. It ought to be an election issue, to put it in a rather crude way. And secondly, I think that they have to go back to almost the Newman-like concept of what a university is, which is an explorer of the wider boundaries of thought, whether those thoughts are scientific or whether they're humanistic, because they do come together in the end. On the question of the... can I leap to professionalisation? What was the middle question?
Conviction politics, what's happened to it?
Oh, no, that's the same question, I think. Yeah. Let me say quite directly, I wonder how many of you read last week's Observer, and many of you noticed the passionate outcry of my dear friend, Sarah Tether, a woman not yet 30 or just at 30. And so you can't really, one cannot talk just about professionalisation. What one has to talk about is the price being paid for people who speak out, and with great agony in her case.
A fellow Catholic, I think?
A fellow Catholic, yes, a very good Catholic. But Sarah spoke out against what she regarded as the awfulness of the benefit limit on families, because she believes very strongly, having been Minister for Children, that the system of a benefit ceiling is bound to drive people with big families into more and more despair. And that's partly a function of the ludicrous levels of rent in this city, which mean that you can't easily bring up a family if you have an ordinary wage in this city at all anymore. We're becoming a bit like Cape Town was, with all the people at work being in townships outside, miles and miles away, and that's happening to London right now. So she pleaded a very unpopular case with great passion, the unpopular case that there should not be a ceiling on benefits. And I can tell you right away that even in her own constituency, that wouldn't go down terribly well. It's not a popular attitude. Any more, for example, than arguing, as some of us have done, that people who are in prison for offences without violence should not be compelled not to have a vote. There are all kinds of issues like this, and they crop up all the time. What are the two things that undermine what you might call conviction politics? The first of them is that the existence in this country of large blocks of media control with very powerful influence on the public, who play very, very strongly on the public's fears. Look at the Express any day of the week on the subject of immigration, and you wouldn't know that most of us ring up a Polish plumber when our bathroom goes skew with, let alone the scores and scores of East Europeans who serve in almost all our cafes and pubs, because on the whole, Brits don't much want to do that kind of work, and it's very badly paid. So there is this kind of constant row that goes on, constant moral argument, and it's much harder to meet than it used to be. And the people we haven't got round to yet, Twitter and tweet, make it harder still, because they play almost directly on what one might call the smallest-minded prejudices, because they can't express anything in any length because they don't allow it. Secondly, the other element of professionalisation of politics is quite straightforwardly that without the support of, on the one hand, the landed gentry, on the other hand, of the trade unions, you haven't got many politicians anymore who've got their own means, either because they've got strong supporters, the trade unions, or because they've got their own wealth, and therefore are able to risk having to resign from their positions because they can see some other source of funding for their families and the people for whom they're responsible. And don't underestimate that factor, because to resign and give up your whole political career when there is no other source of income, or not an adequate source of income for your family, is a very, very tough thing to do. So professionalisation of politics, yes. Understanding reasons, yes. And also, finally, the existence of an extraordinarily brave group of members of parliament of all parties who still stand up for what they believe in, even though the price of doing so is much, much higher than it used to be.
Can I just press you a bit on that? I mean, talking about moral compasses and failures, why were politicians, why did they not criticise what was happening in the financial industry? Why wasn't there any control over that? And why is it still not really being got a grip of? Is that something to do with moral compass, or are there other explanations for that failure?
There were an endless series of questions and debates on the subject of the financial thing. And you may remember, I'm speaking of my own party, we've had a colossal debate about things like the mansion tax and the wealth tax and all the rest of it. What we're learning, and it's a hard lesson to learn, I've taken a big interest in this myself. What's a really hard lesson to learn is that we've produced a global situation, which means that the most sophisticated and clever banks and companies can simply escape paying tax altogether. I'll give you an example. I asked a question only yesterday in the House of Lords to just give you an example of that. The question was about what we could do about the fact that there is now 19 billion British pounds in Jersey. In Jersey, no tax of any kind is payable on capital gains or on corporate profits, believe it or not. No tax is payable, which means that if a company like Starbucks, take a recent example, or Amazon, decide to register in Jersey or Guernsey or the Channel Islands, let alone the Cayman Islands and all the rest of them, Turks and Caicos, what then happens is that they don't pay any tax at all, almost none, although they're hugely profit-making. And that means that for the average man or woman who decently pays their taxes, or is forced to pay their taxes because of pay as you earn, there's this feeling that you're endlessly climbing up a hill that seems to be growing, because as fast as we're able to get a more fair system of taxation in this country, for example, by raising the tax threshold at the bottom end, the faster corporates take themselves off into tax havens. And for some reasons which I find, well, I do understand completely. What is the reason for that? It's frankly because nation states are not prepared to accept international laws in this field. Simple as that. And the Daily Mail, I can promise you, would go to town on the subject of any kind of international law about tax evasion.
So the media have lost a moral compass. Politicians haven't particularly. Where else? I mean, crime's down. Where else do you see the loss of moral compass? It's not across the board.
It is pretty well across the board.
You
yes.
do think?
Yes. I mean, look at the professions. Law. Far too many people in the legal business find ways to bring cases. I mean, you've probably seen my face that I've cut myself. Yes, I have. I slipped up in Westminster on a manhole cover. Everybody said to me, are you going to sue Westminster Council? No, I think it's absurd. I mean, I slipped up on a manhole cover, so bad luck. And I got a perfectly free NHS, so I want to go there. So I have reason to be grateful. But people are now playing the game of suing about everything, which is what happens in the United States as well. And that gives the legal profession the chance of having very well-paid jobs for what I can only describe as a fairly lousy system of law. Doctors hold on. They're probably the profession that does best and has most trust from the people. The police, deeply under suspicion. Look at West Yorkshire. Look at the arguments about the following up abuse. Children's homes. Look again. The churches, schools. Look again. In area after area after area, areas that were trusted are no longer trusted, even the churches, even the bishops and so on. So I have to say no, I'm afraid the moral compass has gone skew-whiff much more widely than just in banks.
We mustn't forget the euthanasia question.
Oh, I'm so sorry, yes. It's a good question. I think I probably avoided it because it's so difficult. It's so difficult, really, essentially, for a reason that we don't discuss very much, and maybe it's something that you and your programme should discuss, I think, very deeply.
We will be in our next series.
Good. But the usual argument is that it's right or wrong to allow assisted suicide. The fundamental problem is hardly ever addressed. What is the fundamental problem? The fundamental problem is that medical science is now able to keep people alive artificially for a very long period after their natural death. And doctors, to their credit, but it may be no longer a relevant thing, are of course committed to keeping you alive if they possibly can. In the United States, 29% of health expenditure, 29%, goes on the last year of life. Why? Because many modern human beings are not prepared to accept that there's such a thing as death, and they will therefore pay all the fortune they have to keep alive. What does keeping alive mean? It means assisted living, if I can put it that way. It means a life which is often hateful, disagreeable, unpleasant, but you can keep yourself going by ventilators and all the rest of it. When my father died, I said to him, "What do you feel about dying?" Because I'd been told he could be resuscitated from pneumonia for the third time. And he said to me, "I want to go when God wants me to go." It was absolutely the right answer. He slipped away peacefully and mercifully over the next couple of weeks. He was a good Catholic, and he welcomed what might be on the other side. We as a society are now increasingly incapable of accepting death. Of course I believe one should limit pain. Of course I believe in the hospice movement, which I think is wonderful. But I do think we have to begin to ask questions about whether the scientific ability to sustain life in the face of the end of life is actually very
Can I ask you a
sensible.
supplementary? Is the decline of religious faith a factor in this?
I don't know, Cliff. Let me ask you that.
Touche.
Go on then.
Well, my answer would be yes, in a complicated way. And it's not simply that if you've got faith, you welcome death, because you don't. There's an instinct in us not to want to die. And this is true whether you have faith or not. And I don't think faith necessarily acts as a consolation. Some of the people who don't have faith think that that might be the reason why people have it, but it's not. It can actually be the opposite of a consolation. It can make things worse, not better. And you probably experienced that yourself. But it does seem to me that there is the concept of the sacredness of life is one we should not let go of, and it is that there is something special, something specially mysterious we can't really even find words for about what life is, and that has to be respected. Indeed, we have to bend our knee to it. And if we have that attitude to it, it seems to me then we can accept natural outcomes, and we aren't necessarily so scared of it. And then we are scared of it, I think, because we have turned the world into such a utilitarian place, as you were speaking before. And that seems to me why people are very uncomfortable, even with the idea of death. There's very little discussion of death. It's almost the secret, isn't it? The thing we can't really face. I mean, sometimes one would say religion is the thing we can't really face. We all talk about sex all the time, but we can't talk about religion. But there is another one, even more mysterious, and that's death. We find it very hard to talk about.
Let's take another round. There's someone here at the front, and there was someone who's got the microphone already, I think. But please, you go ahead.
Wes Sutton from the already disestablished New Churches. As a politician, how political do you see Jesus in the Gospels?
Please, you go next.
Could I pick up the question about the moral compass? One of the key areas of moral compass, of course, is in schools and in education.
Could you just introduce yourself, sorry?
Sorry, Priscilla Chadwick. The issues about religious education are constantly in the news. RE excluded from Mr. Gove's EBAC. He's savagely cut the numbers for teacher training for next year. RE's under serious threat. You could argue that we should start looking at the other end of the argument and just say religious education is personal. It's not related to the wider aspects of education. We should leave it up to the faith communities to teach it, Catholics to teach Catholic education, Muslims to teach Islamic education, etc. But the tradition in this country has been that RE has always been part of the curriculum of the schools. What is your view, Baroness Williams? I'd be very interested to know whether you think it should still be part of the entitlement to education in this country.
And at the very back, I think. Yes.
Rena Lewis, London College of Fashion. Actually, a question on a related theme. First of all, thank you very much for your statement of support for humanities in higher education, given that that's what I do, and of course believe in passionately. We are moving towards a situation where, as university educators, we're going to be encountering increasing numbers of students who've come through an entirely religious education system in their schooling. Do you think then that the religious institutions should also be running universities if we find that there's demand from students and parents for that in 15 years' time?
Thank you.
I think the issue of education, and much more widely than that, is not really so much an issue about the persecution of Christians. It's an issue about scorn for and ignorance of Christians. Most of our fellow members of the public are fairly well disposed and quite kindly people, but they just see Christianity as irrelevant, really. They see Islam as a challenge. They see Judaism as a sort of slightly quaint old religion, and they see Christianity as irrelevant. So, because I think that religion is a very key part of people's lives, and it's a very key part of the world's life, I've always strongly believed that there should be religion as part of the basic curriculum in schools. Having said that, we are a sufficiently multicultural and multi-religious country now for it to be necessary, I think, to explain not just Christianity, but to say something about what are the main religious beliefs in the world. And you can't go into huge detail because there isn't time under heaven, but you can broadly explain the differences between the Abrahamic religions, that is to say those who believe in a single monotheistic God, and those who believe in many gods or no gods. And I think you need to get across some of the fundamental tenets of religion, as well as the fundamental beliefs of Christianity. So yes, I'm very strongly on that side. And I think what's interesting to me is that in the schools that are faith schools, and there are a very high proportion of faith schools in England, there is a broad acceptance by parents who may not be particularly religious themselves of the idea that their children should have religious education, as long as it isn't seen to be doctrinal. They object to that. They get worried if they think that they're going to be taught that there isn't any, for example, environmental. There's a kind of literal issue about the beginning of the earth and so forth. And there are obviously extreme kinds of religious views which people are worried about. But generally speaking, most parents are happy with the idea of explaining in the broad sense what religion's about, what God's meant to be, etc. And I think that's probably quite a good thing. It's harder when you get to universities because you've got children who have now become young people and are therefore likely to be much more critical. And I personally think about that it's what I said earlier, it's essential that Christians hold their ground, are prepared to argue, don't just fall back and say it's a matter of faith without arguing the case. One of the things I've always liked about the Catholic Church is that it's been on the whole much more inclined to engage in intellectual dialogue with other faiths and with itself than some other, for example, some of the evangelical churches are. And I think that's a lesson one should take up to the universities as well.
So do you think Michael Gove's wrong not to include it as a core subject?
Yes, he's wrong.
He is wrong.
Oh, well, in my view. And it's very odd from a very conservative.
Yes.
Can I chip in
Yes.
a point that seems to me that one of the purposes of education that gets missed is about character formation. It's about moulding future citizens to be what we would regard as virtuous. And in other words, not just a question of imparting knowledge so that they will be more employable, but also forming them as adults and mature individuals in all the respects that those words have meaning. And it would seem to me that it is in that context that religious education makes sense, because it, as it were, provides a philosophical basis, a theoretical basis as to why character formation is so important. How are we doing?
We are going to have to finish. I'm really sorry. Yeah, go on.
I am Alistair.
You're going to have a final question, are you, Alistair?
Pardon? Yeah, that's a question.
Okay, quick one, very quick.
I'm a student at Lancaster University, and I just wanted to ask this question to Baroness. The Catholic Church, well, religion, and most specifically the Catholic Church, is obsessed with sex. and control. The Catholic Church confines its bishops to a life of celibacy.
Get to the question.
She's
got to go back to the House of Lords.
No, it'll be quick, don't worry. And the Pope Benedict, the current Pope Benedict, goes to Africa and discourages its people from using condoms, continents ravaged by AIDS. And finally, women have been, within the Catholic Church, have been degraded and confined to the position of, I think, to use your quote, obedient worshippers. What authority do you think that the Catholic Church...
I've got to answer, I'm afraid, but I daren't miss the vote. It's one or two votes are going to make all the difference. So forgive me if I answer the bit of your question you've asked, because you'll have to forgive me, I've got to go. I wouldn't say if I hadn't. But what I would say very quickly is, yes, the Roman Catholic Church is obsessed with sex, and society is obsessed with sex. Yeah. But the one belongs to the other.
No, stop.